The American colonists' fight for independence was rooted in their fury over what they saw as economic tyranny from a distant monarchy and its parliament. They sought to break free from a system where sovereignty resided with a king and queen, and establish a new kind of government where sovereignty belonged to the people. The American colonists' decision to fight for independence was rooted in their fury over what they saw as economic tyranny from a distant monarchy and its parliament. This was particularly true after 1763, when the British Parliament, facing immense war debt, imposed taxes like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, violating the core principle of no taxation without representation and threatening their property rights. The colonists did not merely want to separate themselves from a wealthy class. They sought to break free from a monarchy and establish a new kind of government entirely, one where sovereignty resided with the people, not a king or queen. When the Revolutionary War began in 1775, men like Daniel Shays, a farmer, fought as patriots, believing they were risking their lives to establish a new republic where government would serve the people, ensure justice, and never again tax citizens into ruin to benefit a distant monarch, forming the foundation of the independent states under the weak Articles of Confederation. The war was won, but the peace brought a new, cruel tyranny from the Americans' own government, one that mirrored the oppression they had just defeated. Veterans like Captain Daniel Shays, having served with distinction at Bunker Hill, returned home facing ruin because all the states were deeply in debt. The root of the crisis was the immense Revolutionary War debt, which states had financed by issuing war bonds and certificates used to pay soldiers and acquire supplies. These soldiers, lacking payment during the war, were given pay certificates, paper IOUs, or promissory notes representing their owed wages, and backed by the government's solemn but uncertain promise to pay the full face value in gold or silver at a later date. Upon returning home, these veterans were not just owed money, they were utterly destitute. Years of military service had pulled them away from their farms and businesses, leaving their families in poverty. They had no income, and faced immediate financial obligations, including back taxes and debts they had incurred while away fighting. Their desperate need for immediate cash to feed their families and pay their bills was so overwhelming that the promissory notes, which had no current value, were worthless to them. They needed money now, not a vague promise of payment in the future. This is why they were forced to sell these pay certificates for practically nothing, pennies on the dollar, to shrewd, wealthy buyers like the Boston merchants and speculators who now dominated the state government, and crucially, the state of Massachusetts had borrowed heavily from this powerful group of Boston creditors to finance its war efforts. The injustice was staggering. The farmers were being crushed by taxes to pay off loans held by the very people who were simultaneously exploiting their desperation and buying up their pay certificates for dirt cheap. With cash, gold, and silver coin extremely scarce in rural communities, the state government, in a move that terrified the wealthy elite in Boston, refused to issue paper money, a deliberate choice by the creditors who feared inflation would devalue the war bonds they had purchased at a discount. The crucial act of betrayal was the state legislature's decision, driven by these creditors, to fully honor these pay certificates at 100% of their face value, making the wealthy purchasers instantly rich. The Boston elite, now the state's principal creditors, demanded repayment of the state's debt at full face value, and only in hard currency, securing a massive wartime profit. The state had refused to pay the veterans, yet it now demanded they find gold to pay off the wealthy bondholders, refusing to accept the certificates or farm goods as payment. The farmers of western Massachusetts were never informed of the political maneuvers, that the government's tax policy was strategically designed to benefit their rich urban creditors, and that failure to pay these new crushing taxes meant the immediate loss of their family farms, which they had effectively been forced to put up as collateral for a war fought for a broke state. This deliberate lack of information made their sacrifice an unwitting act of self-destruction. The state government's policies created a crisis that affected tens of thousands of citizens across the region, systematically squeezing the agrarian population for taxes to enrich the financial class. The taxes levied were a poll tax, a fixed amount per person, regardless of income, and a property tax on land. both of which disproportionately burdened farmers who had land, but very little hard currency. The tax rate in Massachusetts was also significantly higher than in neighboring states, which had either delayed collections or issued paper currency to help their citizens. The farmer, who had only corn and labor to offer, was refused, and his only recourse was ruin, as the county courts, protected by Governor James Bowdoin's regime, began issuing swift judgments that led to the foreclosure and auction of family farms and the imprisonment of war heroes in debtor's prison. A betrayal compounded by betrayal as the state confiscated the property of patriots to enrich the elite. Realizing that Governor Bowdoin's state government was actively destroying them, the farmers, calling themselves regulators, rallied under Daniel Shays and rose up in a just act of self-defense. Before resorting to arms, the farmers had sent numerous petitions to the state legislature, pleading for a moratorium on debts and the issuance of paper money, but their pleas were met with cold silence and inaction. Their simple, powerful goal was to shut down the courts to stop the foreclosures and jailings. On a crisp September morning, hundreds of them, armed with a mix of muskets and the very farm tools they were fighting to save, pitchforks and scythes, marched on the county courthouse at Northampton, forcing the judges to adjourn the court. A peaceful yet powerful act repeated at courthouses across the state, bringing the machinery of debt to a grinding halt. This righteous resistance horrified the elite, and since the state treasury was too poor to afford an army, Governor Bowdoin, acting as the single figure of power, called upon the Boston merchants to personally finance a substantial militia, a funding effort organized and heavily supported by the governor's own circle and the wealthiest of the Massachusetts merchant class, the very people who stood to lose the most if the farmers succeeded in canceling the state debt, which they held. Bowdoin himself was one of the largest personal subscribers to the fund and was already one of the state's biggest creditors, holding state debt notes. His personal financial stake in suppressing the rebellion was immense. Other key private subscribers included prominent Boston merchant Thomas Russell, the influential Phillips family, and other members of the River Gods families. These wealthy men quickly raised the vast sum needed to hire a large military force under General Benjamin Lincoln, raising the money through a private subscription, a collective pledge, rather than a single bank loan, because the state treasury was empty, providing the $6,000 to hire the army, an arrangement that formalized the link between the wealthy elite, who were lending the money and owned the debt, and the state government's coercive power, the army that enforced the taxes, with the state legislature later agreeing to reimburse these merchants. The ultimate confrontation occurred in the snows of January 1787, when the rebels made a final, desperate move on the federal armory at Springfield, a force of over 1,000 men, many carrying the muskets they had used against the British, but others gripping the handles of axes and pitchforks, where they were met by a waiting state militia under General Shepherd, which held a strong defensive position with several cannons aimed directly at the approaching farmers. When the patriots advanced, the militia fired cannons loaded with grape shot, and the second volley, meant to kill, ripped through the center of the advancing patriots, instantly killing several men and wounding many more, causing the farmers' line to break and the organized resistance to collapse. After which Lincoln's privately funded army relentlessly pursued the scattered patriots, marching through a snowstorm to surprise the final rebel camp at Petersham and finally breaking their will, which secured the military defeat. The military defeat of the farmers was secured, but the moral victory belonged to the patriots, and Governor Bowdoin, the symbol of the elite's cruel policies, was immediately voted out of office in the next election in April 1787, with his successor swiftly pardoning almost all the participants, recognizing the sheer injustice of the situation, and the new legislature also enacted a moratorium on debts and passed laws to reduce taxes. The heroic fight against the tyranny of Governor James Bowdoin and the wealthy creditors became the most urgent argument for creating a stronger, more just national constitution. The rebellion was terrifying evidence to national leaders like George Washington and James Madison that the government under the Articles of Confederation was fundamentally too weak to maintain order or protect property rights, because it had no power to intervene when a single state, controlled by a specific leader with personal financial interests, acted unjustly against its own citizens. This crisis proved to the founders that their first attempt at self-governance had failed. It was this failure that led them to call for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in May 1787. Not to amend the old government, but to figure out a better system, one that could create a stronger federal government capable of preventing such domestic insurrections, regulating a stable currency, and balancing the power between debtors and creditors, thereby protecting the liberty of all citizens.